A Mark Brown Arthur chapter book. Arthur and the Popularity Test text by Stephen Krensky, based on the teleplay by Sandra Willard. For My Dad, Bud. Chapter 1. All across Elwood City, kids were getting ready to go to the community center. Be careful with those things, Sue Ellen's mother cautioned. They're fragile. I'm always careful, said Sue Ellen. She wrapped up a gong of pounded metal, a gourd-shaped rattle, a small drum, and a tiny stringed instrument made of bent wood. Then she put them in her backpack. There, she said. Perfect. Over at Fern's house, Fern was filling her pack, too, with a cowbell and some rawhide strips. I think that's everything, she said. Then she looked up at her bookshelf. She pulled down a book. But maybe I should just leave it home, she thought. I doubt anybody will be interested. She started to put the book back. Don't be such a coward, a voice in her head scolded. Besides, even if you bring it, you can still chicken out at the last minute. True enough, Fern sighed. She added the book to her pack and hurried out the door. Francine was supposed to be going out her own door, too, but she wasn't ready yet. She grumbled, trying to fit a metal rod into her backpack. This backpack just isn't big enough. It already held a whole bunch of wooden dowels and some bells. There's no way to make everything fit, she muttered. Glancing around the room, she noticed her sister's backpack lying on her bed. Catherine, she said aloud, your backpack is bigger than mine. Would you mind if I borrowed it today? Of course not, she imagined Catherine replying. After all, you're the best little sister in the whole world. So kind, so considerate. I can't refuse you anything. Take my clothes, my allowance. Thank you, said Francine, smiling. Just the backpack for now. She emptied out her own pack and shoved all the contents into Catherine's. At the Reed house, Arthur had also given up on fitting everything in his backpack. He needed a large shopping bag, too. His father had put in a gourd, a bag of dried peas, some large tin cans, and a piece of cheesecloth. He tied the bag tightly onto the back of Arthur's bike. D.W. was watching. Don't forget the kitchen sink, she told Arthur. You've got everything else. Very funny, said Arthur. Mr. Reed finished fastening the bundle and stood up. You certainly do have a lot here. These spring break activity days are pretty serious. Arthur nodded. Especially with Mr. Ratburn in charge. His father gave the shopping bag one last pat. You're really going to make musical instruments out of all this? He asked. Sue Ellen has done it before, Arthur explained. She says our group will have the best project in the whole community center. I look forward to seeing the results, said Mr. Red. Maybe you can give a concert afterward. Maybe, said Arthur. If I made noise with those things, said D.W., I'd get in trouble. Arthur just smiled. You might make noise, he said. We're making music. Chapter 2. As Arthur arrived at the community center, the stuff in the shopping bag rattled and clanked on his bike. Buster and the Brain walked over to see what all the noise was about. What's that racket? Asked Buster. Arthur laughed. All the stuff I've brought to make musical instruments. It doesn't sound very musical, Buster noted. Whose idea was that project? Asked the Brain. Sue Ellen's, said Arthur. She's in my group, along with Francine and Fern. You're lucky, said Buster. We were assigned to Muffy and Jenna. It's hard getting them to agree to anything. Buster and I want to make some futuristic armor, said the Brain. Muffy and Jenna want to weave baskets. He and Buster both stuck out their tongues and made choking noises. Maybe you can figure out a way to combine your interests, said Arthur. I'll put some thought into that, said the brain. Wishful thinking, said Buster with a sigh. When Arthur entered the crafts room, he took a seat at the table with Sue Ellen, Fern, and Francine. Did you bring everything? Sue Ellen asked. Arthur nodded. My dad really loaded me up. Wait till you see what I've made already, said Sue Ellen. She took out her instruments. I made these at home. It's easy. Arthur picked up the gourd rattle in one hand and tapped the drum with the other. Hey, he said, I can play both at the same time. Fern cleared her throat. I had an idea, she said hesitantly. Everyone looked at her. Well, it's not a big idea, really. It's just something we could do along with the instruments. She slid a book slowly out of her pack. Francine grabbed it. Poems, said Francine, frowning. You've brought us poems? Fern nodded shyly. I was thinking that we could read a poem while we play the instruments. Or I could read while you play. It would be a kind of performance. I don't think I'll be making poem music, said Arthur, rattling the gourd. Francine put the book on the table. And no one would hear the poem over the instruments anyway. Fern looked down. She was sorry she had even mentioned it. Okay, she said quietly. I guess you're right. She slid the book away again. Arthur dumped out all the stuff from his pack. Okay, here's everything from my dad. He looked at the pile. I have one idea already. He poured the dried peas into a can and covered it with cheesecloth. When he shook it, the can sounded like the gourd. Great, said Sue Ellen. Let's see what we can do with my stuff, said Francine. She emptied out her pack. Along with her dowels, metal bar, and bells, there was a magazine. Hey, said Francine. This isn't mine. Oh, I get it. This must have been in Catherine's backpack already. Arthur picked it up and looked at the cover. Popular Girl, he read aloud. He held it out at arm's length, as though it was radioactive. Yuck! This is for teenage girls. He dropped it on the table. I hope I didn't catch anything. Francine, Sue Ellen, and Fern quickly huddled around the fallen magazine. Boo-hoo, said Sue Ellen and Fern. Let me see, said Francine. Remember, it came out of my pack. I hear that teen magazines have all sorts of strange and mysterious articles, said Sue Ellen. Do we dare look? Asked Fern. Of course, said Francine. But not now, said Mr. Ratburn, appearing from nowhere and sweeping up the magazine. He was in charge of the projects, and he planned to keep the kids focused. You can have this back at break time, he said. The girls groaned, but there was nothing they could do. Popular Girl was just going to have to wait. Chapter 3. At break time, Francine, Sue Ellen, and Fern quickly ran outside to read Popular Girl at a picnic table. Arthur kept his distance from them, but he stayed close enough to hear everything they said. It says here you can get a prom date in 12 days or less, said Fern. What's a prom? Some kind of dance, I think, said Sue Ellen. And you have to wear a really uncomfortable dress, said Francine. How do you know that? Asked Fern. I heard Catherine talking about them. Lots of times the dress won't even fit in a regular car. You have to take a limousine. That could be fun, said Sue Ellen. Francine shuddered. Not if you're uncomfortable. I'll bet you anything that those dresses itch, too. Fern and Sue Ellen nodded. Did I hear someone mention dresses? Asked Muffy, who had just come outside with Jenna. Uncomfortable dresses, said Francine. Muffy wasn't listening. Is that popular girl? She gasped. The other girls nodded. I can't wait till I'm old enough to know what they're talking about, said Muffy. Then I can do everything they say. She pointed to a picture of a girl in a shiny green and orange striped mini dress. I'll be just like that model. She sighed. It'll be heaven. Buster and the Brain came up behind her. They looked at the picture, too. That dress looks like one big lollipop, said Buster. An all-day sucker, the Brain added. Muffy rolled her eyes. As if you two know anything about fashion. Francine flipped through a few more pages. Here's a quiz, she said. How likable are you? Let's take it, said Muffy. I heard these tests can tell you a lot about yourself. Here, everyone take a piece of paper to write down your answers. She tore sheets from her notebook and handed them around. Arthur, Buster, and the Brain laughed as they took their sheets. We don't need some dopey test to tell us if people like us, said Arthur. That's true, said Buster. We can tell by the looks on their faces. Well, looks can be deceiving, Muffy reminded them. Never mind the boys, said Fern, who had found some pencils in her pack and was passing them out. What does it say? Francine read on. Question number 1. If you were a sandwich, would your friends be A. Potato chips, B. Diet soda, C. The plate, or D. Hungry? Definitely potato chips, said Arthur. I agree, said the Brain. This test is making me hungry, said Buster. Did anybody bring a snack? The girls all ignored them and wrote down their answers. Francine read the next question. If you could bring one thing to a desert island, would it be A. Your telephone, B. Your mirror, C. Your 10-speed blow dryer, or D. Your kitchen? This one's harder, said Fern. Francine bit her tongue in thought before making her choice. But before she could continue, a huge gust of wind blew the magazine off the table. It spun end over end and landed in a mud puddle. Is it still readable? Fern asked anxiously. Francine ran over and picked up the soggy, dripping bundle of glop. Sorry, she said. I don't think this patient is going to make it. She dropped the magazine into the trash can. Oh, well, said Sue Ellen. That's the end of that. Chapter 4. When Francine and Arthur got on their bikes at the end of the day, they were still talking about the test. It was weird, said Arthur. Those questions were so strange. And even stranger answers. Who would think of a friend as a potato chip? The test was written for teenagers, Francine explained. So you never know what to expect. Teenagers don't think the way we do. They don't? Arthur stopped to consider this. That's what I'm always thinking about DW, too. Hey, you don't suppose she's a teenager in disguise? Francine laughed. No, I think we're just surrounded by craziness. Believe me, I've watched my sister Catherine in action. Scary? Arthur asked. Very. Sometimes, when I'm lying in bed, I think about Catherine and her friends and try to imagine being their age, the way they talk and dress. Francine shuddered. After that, I can't sleep for hours. Thanks for cheering me up, Francine. Life is hard, Arthur. You'd better get used to it. Oh, really? And I suppose you're an expert. They continued the conversation as they rode off down the street. Fern watched them go. As soon as they rounded the corner, she ran over to the trash can. Then she pulled out Francine's magazine. Popular Girl did not look very crisp, but at least it had dried out. Fern sat down on the steps, trying to separate the pages. "What are you doing?" asked Sue Ellen. Fern jumped. "Oh, it's you. I thought everyone had left. I was talking to Mr. Ratburn for a minute. He had a question about how to tune some of the instruments." "He was. Are you listening to me?" "Sorry," Fern said. "I was just concentrating on trying to read this through the wrinkles." Sue Ellen frowned. "Why bother?" she asked. "I just wanted to answer the rest of the questions. At the end you can find out how likable you are. It says it's very scientific." "So?" Fern smoothed out the pages. "Aren't you curious about yourself?" "No." Sue Ellen paused. "Well, maybe a little." She sat down on the steps next to Fern. "So what do we have to do?" "Finish the test." "Okay," said Sue Ellen. "So where were we?" They went through the rest of the questions, including one asking about their superstitions, another on what they would say when meeting aliens from other planets, and the last, which asked what kind of movie was best for a first date. "How are we supposed to know all this stuff?" said Sue Ellen. "The directions say there are no wrong answers," said